I started thinking about trauma in an informed way when I worked at a psychology clinic. It was in an underserved area. It was a rural area, and we were one of the few games in town. And the owner of the clinic decided that we should all become trauma informed. So we became a trauma informed clinic. And so we were all trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a way to treat traumatized people, especially young people. And that's when I first started to see human behavior, especially counterproductive human behavior, through the lens of trauma. And I've come to see that the effects of trauma are the cause of a lot of mental health issues, obviously, but also physical ailments, relational issues. And now as an executive coach, I see that a lot of the poor leadership behavior that's out there, poor decision-making, can be tracked back to unresolved wounds from the past and so on. So healing from trauma can be a very empowering, profound endeavor in multiple contexts. A lot of bureaucratic, simplistic decision-making is socialized, fear-based thinking. And a lot of socialized, fear-based thinking can be traced back to unresolved wounds and trauma and so on. So a lot of the work I do as a developmental coach for executives is to liberate executives and physicians from socialized thinking. Many dysfunctional leaders are acting these things out. You know, their histories, their unresolved histories. For instance, let's say you have a girl whose father is violent. Okay, so this would be an example of a developmental trauma. She does well. I mean, she's a smart kid, so she does well to blend into the wallpaper. She develops this passive avoidance strategy, and it's absolutely brilliant, and it works really well. And she might use that strategy to get her through middle school, because middle school can be very brutal. So she uses this, kind of passive avoidant, mechanisms and things like that. And she gets through middle school, and it works, serves her perfectly. And she goes into a relationship. She might get married and so on. And this strategy works for her. But contexts change, and eventually the constructs that we use successfully in the past no longer work. Matter of fact, sometimes they start to actually work against us. They become kind of a nemesis. But because they were successful, we tend to cling to them anyway. And so to further the analogy, let's say that the same girl, who's now a woman, is promoted to lead a division in her company at her job. Okay, so during times of stress, as normal human beings do, in which in leadership there are many of those, she will automatically, as humans do, she will automatically default to this avoidant passive mechanism. She'll default to what worked for her in the past, and then she'll fail as a leader, or she'll be a counterproductive or pathological leader. Not because she's incapable of leading. She has all of the tools. I mean, she's got all of the potential, but because she never resolved the trauma that she experienced and never added other strategies for walking effectively in the world. So the strategy she had of the avoidance, the passivity, is like a tool in a toolbox. You don't want to throw it away. It's a good strategy. You want to keep it. The problem would be, for those decades, she never took the time to develop the other tools: assertiveness, speaking out, leaning in, and so on. When we talk about transcending trauma, to understand it, I turn to the work of Robert Kegan. We all know about the stages of child development, or we've heard of them, okay? Jean Piaget is the big childhood development pioneer, and there are others as well. But Piaget and others helped us understand that there are measurable, predictable, observable stages of childhood. And if you skip them or they're disrupted, there's all sorts of issues around that and so on and so forth. But the conventional wisdom became that around our early 20s, there were no more developmental stages. You just kind of turn into an adult box. And you can put things into the box, you can learn more, but there's no more development. You are what you are. But along came Kegan and others, who taught us that there are levels of adult development beyond the childhood levels, stages that we progress through, or not, to reach higher levels of maturity. Now, when we talk about levels of adult development, The first concentric sphere in adult development from Kegan's point of view, we call it the instrumental self-sovereign mind. And about 10% of the college-educated population uses this instrumental self-sovereign filter to make sense of the world. So in this mode, there will be very concrete thinking. It's very consequence and rule driven. So I follow the rules because if I don't, I'll get caught and I'll be punished and so on. It's very fairness obsessed, very black and white thinking, pretty simplistic. Jennifer Garvey Berger teaches us that there are certain questions that are asked at each of these levels that we use to approach the world. For instance, in the instrumental self-sovereign mind, this innermost level of adult development, you'll tend to approach issues with questions like, what's in it for me? What are the rewards and the punishments? Is this fair? If they're doing it, then I get to do it. If I have to do it, they should get to do it, and so on and so forth. If you agree with someone who, and you're using this instrumental self-sovereign filter to make sense of the world, when you agree with someone, it will become a value judgment. So I agree with you because I agree with you, and because you agree with me, you're a good person. And if you disagree with me, it means there's something wrong with you morally, ethically, and so on. So we see this simplistic instrumental self-sovereign mind really playing out in the political arena right now. Okay, so that's the instrumental self-sovereign mind. And so, but many of us stretch past that in our maturity level in the way that we make sense of the world, and we stretch into something, the next concentric sphere called the socialized mind. And this, about 47% of the college-educated population makes sense of the world from this point of view. This is in the socialized mind, you will tend to have an external orientation. So you look outside of yourself for validation. Am I fulfilling the role properly? Do they approve of me? Am I doing it right? And so on. So there's an elevated need to belong. Criticism is experienced as destructive to the self, but you begin to be able to see shades of gray. So it starts to be more of a nuanced, complex way to approach the world. In the socialized mind, the questions that you'll tend to ask when you approach issues are, how will this affect my status in the group? Am I doing this right? Who can tell me if I'm doing this right? And so on and so forth. When you agree with someone and you're in the socialized mind, the generality is, this is a good thing, we agree, so we're part of the group, and being part of the group is the main thing. If you disagree with someone, well, if we work on you enough, someday maybe you'll understand and you'll be part of the group too. The positive manifestation of the socialized mind is very, very good thing. We wouldn't have roads, bridges, cathedrals, sports teams, and so on and so forth if we weren't socialized in some way. If we didn't have that priority of fitting in and getting the job done, and so on and so forth. Many of us are able to stretch past the socialized mind into something called the self-authoring mind. Now, about 41% of the college-educated population makes sense of the world through this lens, the self-authoring lens. In the self-authoring, when you're in the self-authoring lens, you have your own internal authority. You can, set your own agenda. You kind of set your own path. You can hold multiple truths. You start to tolerate ambiguity and paradox and so on and so forth, because that's where the opportunities lie. You can be self-reflective. Definitely, you can be self-directed. Critical thinking starts to come in here. But part of the dark side of the self-authoring is sometimes someone who's over-invested in the self-authoring mode may move into control to achieve their own agenda. And the consequence of that is they'll tend to trend the people around them to these lower levels, kind of pressure people to go to the lower levels because my way or the highway. Okay, so that's the self-authoring mind in about 41%. And the self-authoring mind, that's where effective leadership starts, in the self-authoring mind. If you're stuck in the socialized mind, you'll have trouble with leadership. If you get into the self-authoring mind, then you'll start to be able to lead with effectiveness. So beyond the self-authoring mind, and this is, according to Kegan, the highest level he's witnessed yet. And he calls it the self-transforming mind. And it's kind of rare. 1 to 7% of the college-educated population accesses this level. When you're in the self-transforming mind, you'll thrive in ambiguity, uncertainty, and paradox. And not because that's where the opportunities are, but because that's the way the universe works. And a self-transforming person wants to be part of the universe and be part of the flow, or however you want to say that. And when you're in a self-transforming mind, you can easily hold multiple truths. I mean, that's just, that's the way things are, and it's kind of an assumption. You welcome differences as opportunities for growth. So when you run up into a conflict or something, it's an opportunity. And someone who's in the self-transforming mindset would understand that the self is perpetually incomplete. You're constantly growing, constantly changing. The questions that someone would approach the world using, they would use certain questions in the self-transforming mind when they're approaching the world or an issue is, what am I going to learn from this? How is this going to shape me? I'm going to try to have an impact here, but this is going to impact me as well. So this is kind of a dancing with patterns kind of thing. How is my worldview influencing me? In other words, there's a high level of consciousness about how your biases might affect you, and so on and so forth. So there's an ability to objectify your process. So when someone in the self-transforming mind agrees with you, it really doesn't mean anything. You came from way over here to get here, and I came from way over here to get here. Doesn't really, we just agree on something. But the interesting thing about the self-transforming mind is when there's disagreement, someone in a self-transforming mind will be able to change their thinking, have the ability to change their thinking. They won't necessarily do it, but they'll have the ability to do that. Or they might even, if the argument is good enough, take their thinking and completely turn it on its head. So they're not doormats, but there's very complex thinking, nuanced thinking, and so on and so forth. Now, the historical examples for this are Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, Lincoln. Lincoln was famous for, as his famous biography by Doris Kearns Goodwin. He surrounded himself with people who disagreed with him and used that to get a kind of a higher perspective. Okay, so now what does that have to do with trauma? What does all of that have to do? What do the levels of adult development have to do with trauma? Well, unresolved trauma will tend to trend individuals toward lower levels of adult development. It will tend to stick there. It will provide kind of a glass ceiling. For instance, one consequence of almost all forms of trauma is shame, especially if the trauma involved any kind of humiliation, like sexual abuse, beating, emotional abuse, and so on. So trauma makes people feel wrong down to their bones. So I've had several coaching clients who experience profound anxiety when they're around their clients or colleagues, or just kind of functioning in the day. So essentially, they're experiencing some level of shame, that something is wrong with them, and others will see it, or others are seeing it. So this, by definition, is to be trapped in the negative manifestation of the socialized mind. And that, by definition, is that you can't lead from there effectively. Okay, so the paramount concern in the socialized mindset is, how do I measure up? Am I good enough? What do they think? So if you're experiencing shame, it's like the negative manifestation of the socialized mindset on steroids. And I've experienced this myself. I'm not immune to this stuff. When I was young, I remember walking into a party and feeling overwhelming feeling of shame. Essentially, as I was walking in the door, I was telling myself that everybody was looking at me. So I'm kind of doing this kind of thing, Well, that wasn't true, I'm sure. Probably no one was looking at me. But it was an overwhelming, horrible, almost debilitating feeling. So shame is very narcissistic. I mean, we can feel sorry for the person who's shameful. Sorry for myself when I'm shameful. But it's very narcissistic. It's all about me. Everyone's looking at me, or I'm going to be exposed, and so on and so forth. So when you have an adult with unresolved trauma, good luck trying to get them to access these higher levels of adult development, which are important if you're going to walk effectively in the world, and absolutely required if you're going to be in any kind of leadership position. So it's prudent to spend time recovering or dealing with these trauma issues or transcend, as you said at the beginning of this this question. So you can use your imagination to see the ripple effects of trauma. It's really, it's absolutely staggering when you think of it through the lens of adult development. How it affects individuals, how it affects organizations, the staggering cost of this to organizations, because a lot of their cognitive and emotional energies are getting consumed by that. And companies pay their people to direct their cognitive and emotional energies, their passion, toward a task, a mission, or purpose. Okay, so this cost is staggering.